In 2019, one arrest sent shockwaves through the American justice system. A man who had moved quietly among billionaires, politicians, academics, and royalty was suddenly in federal custody. But this was not just another criminal case. This was a story about power, influence, and a system forced into the spotlight. For years, questions had lingered in court documents, sealed records, and investigative reports. How did a convicted offender maintain access to elite networks? Why did a controversial plea agreement shape the course of the case so dramatically? And what happened inside a federal detention center that turned prosecution into permanent uncertainty? This is not a story built on speculation. It is built on documented records, legal proceedings, and institutional findings. Over the next few minutes, we will examine the timeline, the agreements, the arrest, and the aftermath step by step, because sometimes the most important questions are not about what was proven, but about what changed the system forever. And once you see how each piece connects, you may never look at power the same way again. The rise of a man no one fully understood in the world of wealth, power, and private influence. Some figures operate in plain sight while remaining almost entirely unknown, and few embodied that paradox more than Jeffrey Epstein. He was not a celebrity, not an elected official, not the public face of a corporation, yet he moved effortlessly among billionaires, politicians, royalty, and academics, a presence that seemed both visible and invisible at the same time. Born in Brooklyn in 1953, Epstein did not come from elite circles. Yet by the early 2000s, he had gained access to some of the most exclusive networks in the United States and beyond, raising a question that still lingers today. How did he rise so quickly into rooms few ever enter? He began his career in finance, briefly working at Bear Stearns, before leaving under circumstances that have been widely discussed but never fully clarified. A departure that marked the beginning of a pattern where key details always seemed slightly out of focus. Soon after, Epstein established himself as a financial consultant, claiming to manage money for ultra-wealthy clients. Yet the specifics of his investment strategy remained remarkably opaque, fueling curiosity about how he accumulated his fortune. Unlike traditional financiers, he did not publicize performance metrics, hedge fund structures, or large institutional partnerships, and that absence of transparency would later become one of the central mysteries surrounding his life. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Epstein owned multiple properties, including a Manhattan townhouse reportedly among the largest private residences in New York City, a private island in the Caribbean, and estates in Florida and New Mexico, assets that projected extraordinary wealth without conventional explanation. At the same time, he cultivated relationships across political parties, social elites, and prestigious universities, donating to scientific research and forming connections with prominent academics, a strategy that positioned him at the intersection of influence and credibility. Photos from that era show him attending high-profile events, hosting gatherings, and maintaining friendships that spanned ideological divides, reinforcing an image of a man deeply embedded in global networks of power. Yet beneath the surface, questions were quietly forming questions about how influence operates behind closed doors, and who truly benefits from proximity to power. In 2005, allegations began to emerge in Florida involving inappropriate conduct with underage girls, triggering an investigation that would eventually expose one of the most controversial plea deals in modern legal history. The 2008 non-prosecution agreement allowed Epstein to serve a brief sentence in county jail with work release, a resolution that shocked observers and sparked debate about whether wealth and connections can shape legal outcomes. For years, the case seemed to fade from national headlines, but it never fully disappeared, lingering in legal filings and investigative journalism as a story unfinished. Then, in 2019, federal prosecutors in New York brought new charges, arresting Epstein on allegations of sex trafficking minors. And suddenly the case re-entered public consciousness with unprecedented intensity. The details revealed in court documents painted a disturbing picture of recruitment networks, financial settlements, and carefully structured agreements. Yet many aspects of the broader story remained fragmented, and as the investigation expanded, attention shifted not only to the charges themselves, but to the ecosystem of relationships surrounding him, on an ecosystem that extended into spheres rarely scrutinized so publicly. Who knew what and when? How did prior investigations resolve so quietly? Why did certain warnings appear to go unheeded? These questions did not come from rumor or speculation. but from official records, court proceedings, and public testimony, creating a complex narrative where documented facts intersected with unanswered uncertainties. When Epstein was found dead in his jail cell in August 2019, ruled a suicide by medical examiners, the story took an even more dramatic turn, triggering widespread debate and scrutiny over jail procedures, oversight failures, and institutional accountability. Multiple investigations later concluded that severe lapses in monitoring occurred that night. Yet for many observers, procedural explanations did not eliminate deeper doubts about systemic failure. And so, the case evolved from a criminal prosecution into something broader, a reflection of how power, privilege, law enforcement, and institutional responsibility interact in modern America. This is not simply the story of one man. It is a story about influence. It is a story about accountability. It is a story about how systems respond or fail to respond when confronted with allegations involving wealth and power. We examine a 2008 plea agreement in greater detail, analyzing how it was negotiated, why it drew national criticism, and what it reveals about prosecutorial discretion in high-profile cases, because sometimes the most revealing details are hidden not in what is said, but in what is negotiated behind closed doors. The 2008 plea agreement, a deal that changed the narrative by 2006. The investigation in Palm Beach, Florida had grown beyond local concern and into something far more serious. And what began as allegations from a single teenager soon expanded into testimony from multiple accusers, transforming a quiet inquiry into a case that demanded national attention. Detectives gathered statements, reviewed evidence, and presented findings that suggested a pattern of misconduct, and prosecutors initially considered pursuing serious felony charges that could have resulted in substantial prison time. Yet behind the public filings and courtroom language, negotiations were unfolding in private, and it was within those closed-door discussions that the trajectory of the case began to shift in ways that few fully understood at the time. Federal prosecutors became involved, reviewing evidence that could have supported broader charges, including potential federal offenses. And for a moment, it appeared the case might expand rather than narrow. But instead of a sweeping indictment, a resolution emerged in 2008, known formally as a non-prosecution agreement, an arrangement that would later become one of the most debated legal decisions in modern American criminal justice. Under the agreement, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges of solicitation and procurement of a minor for prostitution, avoiding federal prosecution entirely, and receiving a sentence of 18 months in county jail with work release. The structure of the deal allowed him to leave the facility for extended hours each day, returning only to sleep, a condition that drew sharp criticism from observers who questioned whether equal justice had truly been applied. Perhaps most controversial was a provision granting immunity from federal prosecution not only to Epstein but also to unnamed potential co-conspirators, language that would later become central to legal challenges and public debate. Critics argued that the agreement appeared unusually lenient given the seriousness of the allegations, while defenders maintained that plea negotiations are complex and often reflect evidentiary realities rather than public perception. What made the deal especially contentious was the claim that victims were not fully informed of the federal agreement before it was finalized, raising concerns about compliance with the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Years later, litigation would revisit that question, with courts examining whether procedural obligations were properly met. And although certain rulings acknowledged failures in victim notification, the plea agreement itself ultimately remained intact. To some legal analysts, the case became a study in prosecutorial discretion, illustrating how resource constraints, evidentiary assessments, and negotiation leverage can shape outcomes in ways the public rarely sees. To others, it became a symbol of systemic imbalance, reinforcing a perception that wealth and influence can alter the gravity of legal consequences, even when formal procedures are followed. The defense team involved in the negotiations included high-profile attorneys, individuals experienced in navigating complex federal cases, and their strategy appeared to focus on limiting exposure before broader charges could be formalized. Meanwhile, prosecutors have stated in interviews that they believed the agreement secured a conviction and mandatory sex offender registration, outcomes they viewed as preferable to the uncertainty of trial, a calculation that remains debated to this day. The documents associated with the plea deal reveal detailed back-and-forth communications, emphasizing the tactical nature of negotiations in high-stakes cases, and demonstrating how outcomes often hinge not on dramatic courtroom moments, but on structured legal compromise. Yet compromise in criminal justice can carry long shadows. And as years passed, investigative journalists revisited the agreement, scrutinizing timelines, correspondency, and internal decision-making processes that had once received little national coverage. By the late 2010s, renewed reporting reignited scrutiny, particularly after emerging accounts from additional accusers suggested patterns that extended beyond the original Florida case. Public attention intensified, not only because of the allegations themselves, but because the 2008 agreement appeared to have foreclosed federal avenues that might have expanded the scope of accountability. And so the plea deal became more than a legal document. It became a focal point in a broader conversation about transparency, prosecutorial power, and institutional responsibility. Was the agreement a pragmatic resolution shaped by legal realities? Or did it reveal vulnerabilities in how high-profile defendants navigate the justice system? These questions do not rely on speculation. They arise directly from court records, judicial opinions, and official statements that remain part of the public archive. In 2019, when federal prosecutors in New York announced new charges, they made clear that the earlier agreement did not shield Epstein from prosecution outside the Southern District of Florida, signaling a significant shift in federal posture. That moment reframed the 2008 deal, transforming it from a concluded chapter into a controversial prelude, and prompting renewed examination of how it had been constructed in the first place. Legal scholars began analyzing the case in academic forums, citing it as an example of the tension between negotiation, efficiency, and public accountability, a tension that exists in many criminal proceedings but rarely attracts such sustained scrutiny. And as the narrative expanded, the plea agreement stood at the center of it all, a document negotiated quietly, but destined to be dissected publicly for years to come. Now, we examine the broader network of associations surrounding Epstein during and after the plea agreement period, analyzing how influence, philanthropy, and reputation management intersected with ongoing legal exposure, because sometimes the most revealing patterns are not found in isolated documents, but in the connections that bind them together. The network, power, proximity, and public silence after the 2008 plea agreement. Jeffrey Epstein did not disappear from elite social circles, and in many ways, his public presence appeared surprisingly resilient despite the legal outcome that might have ended most careers. Photographs, guest logs, and archived interviews from the years following the conviction show continued interaction with influential figures across business, academia, politics, and entertainment, raising questions about how reputation can be managed even after serious controversy. It is important to distinguish documented associations from allegations, because proximity does not equal participation. Yet the optics of continued access became part of the larger narrative that refused to fade. Epstein cultivated an image of intellectual patronage, presenting himself as a supporter of scientific research and philanthropy, funding initiatives tied to universities and research institutions that benefited from private donations. High-profile academic institutions acknowledged receiving financial contributions connected to him. And in later years, several conducted internal reviews, examining how those donations were accepted and categorized. For some observers, these relationships suggested the power of social capital, demonstrating how networks built over decades can create insulation, even in the aftermath of criminal conviction. For others, the issue was not association alone, but whether influence allowed reputational recovery that would have been impossible for an ordinary defendant. Flight logs from Epstein's private aircraft, later entered into court records during civil litigation, fueled speculation about the scope of his social reach, though legal experts repeatedly cautioned that appearing on a flight manifest does not imply wrongdoing. Still, the existence of such documents intensified public curiosity, because records are tangible, and tangible evidence often carries more psychological weight than abstract denials. Media investigations revisited archived footage of social events attended by Epstein years after his plea deal, highlighting the tension between public knowledge of his conviction and private willingness to maintain contact. Some individuals publicly distanced themselves once renewed scrutiny began, while others emphasized that their interactions had been limited or strictly professional. The pattern revealed something broader about power structures. Influence rarely operates in isolation, and elite networks often function through layered relationships that blur the boundaries between business, philanthropy, and personal connection. As journalists analyzed these connections, a central question emerged. How does someone rebuild credibility after a conviction that would permanently define most individuals? Part of the answer may lie in strategic silence. because silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity allows narratives to evolve without direct confrontation. For nearly a decade after the plea agreement, national coverage of the case diminished, and without sustained spotlight, public memory gradually receded. But absence of coverage does not equal absence of activity, and investigative reporting later suggested that allegations and civil settlements continued behind the scenes. Civil lawsuits filed by accusers introduced new testimony into public records, and with each filing, fragments of a larger picture appeared to surface, though not always in linear or easily interpreted form. The legal system treats criminal prosecution and civil litigation differently, yet both generate documentation, and documentation becomes the foundation upon which narratives are reconstructed years later. By the late 2010s, journalists began revisiting old records with fresh perspective, asking whether the earlier plea agreement had obscured a broader pattern that was only now being understood in full context. The renewed attention did not arise spontaneously. It followed detailed investigative work that reassembled time, interviewed accusers, and reassessed correspondence from the original case. As media coverage intensified, former associations that once attracted little comment suddenly became headline material, and proximity transformed from social trivia into public controversy. The story evolved from a local Florida case into a national conversation about accountability, influence, and institutional oversight. Yet even as scrutiny grew, definitive answers about the full scope of Epstein's network remained elusive. Because social networks are complex and layered, rarely fitting into simple diagrams or single headlines, legal proceedings require evidence that meets specific standards, while public discourse often moves faster than formal adjudication, creating tension between what is provable and what is suspected. This gap between suspicion and substantiation became one of the defining features of the case, and it shaped how audiences processed every new development. By 2019, when federal authorities in New York unsealed new charges, the network that once seemed dormant was suddenly central to national headlines again. The indictment alleged a pattern extending beyond the original Florida case, reframing earlier questions about influence and accountability in a far more urgent light. And with renewed federal action, attention shifted from past associations to present consequences. As investigators examined financial records, property holdings, and communication trails, the narrative no longer revolves solely around a plea deal from 2008. It expanded into a broader inquiry into systems, safeguards, and whether previous legal resolutions had left critical questions unanswered. But perhaps the most compelling element was not who appeared in photographs or on guest lists, but why so many aspects of the story resurfaced only after years of relative quiet. Because sometimes the most revealing detail is not what was visible at the time, but what remained unnoticed until circumstances forced it back into the light. Now, we turn to 2019, the arrest in New York, the detention at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, and the events surrounding Epstein's death that would ignite global debate. Because when a case shifts from legal complexity to unanswered finality, the questions only grow louder. 2019. The arrest, the cell, and a moment that stopped the story in July 2019. Nearly 11 years after the controversial plea agreement in Florida, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York arrested Jeffrey Epstein on new charges, signaling a dramatic shift in how the case was being approached at the highest level of the U.S. justice system. The indictment alleged sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, reframing the narrative from a localized case to a federal prosecution with national and international implications. This time, there was no negotiated resolution waiting quietly in the background, and no suggestion of work release privileges or leniency, creating an atmosphere of final accountability that immediately captured global attention. Epstein was denied bail, with prosecutors arguing that his financial resources, private aircraft history, and prior conduct made him a flight risk, and the federal judge agreed, ordering him held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. For many observers, this decision represented a turning point, a moment when the justice system appeared determined to confront the case without compromise. Inside the MCC, Epstein was placed in a special housing unit, a decision that would later become central to intense scrutiny, because conditions of confinement matter when the stakes are this high. Court filings and subsequent reports indicated that he was initially placed on suicide watch, then later removed, a sequence of decisions that would be questioned repeatedly in the weeks that followed. On August 10, 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell, and shortly thereafter pronounced dead an event that instantly transformed an ongoing prosecution into a global controversy. The New York City medical examiner ruled his death as suicide by hanging, a conclusion supported by official findings. Yet the circumstances surrounding the event prompted widespread public. People were really skeptical about it. Questions emerged immediately. Why were guards reportedly asleep during scheduled checks? Why were security cameras malfunctioning? And how did multiple safeguards fail simultaneously in a facility designed for high-risk detainees? A federal review process was initiated to examine what had occurred, and later reports acknowledged serious lapses in protocol, describing understaffing, overwork, and procedural breakdowns that night. 2 correctional officers were charged with falsifying records, though those cases were later resolved without trial, adding another layer of complexity to public perception. For the legal system, Epstein's death represented a procedural failure. For the public, it became a psychological rupture, because unresolved stories rarely end cleanly. With the defendant gone, criminal prosecution ceased, but the questions did not, and in many ways, they intensified, shifting from legal outcomes to institutional accountability. Civil lawsuits continued, and courts unsealed previously confidential documents related to settlements and depositions, introducing new information into public view. The unsealing of records did not create definitive answers, but it expanded the documentary trail, reinforcing the idea that the case was larger than any single proceeding. Media coverage surged, not because of new allegations alone, but because the ending itself felt incomplete, a narrative interruption that denied closure. In the absence of a trial, evidence was never tested in open court. Witnesses were never cross-examined before a jury, and conclusions remained legally unfinished. This absence became a focal point for public discourse, because trials serve not only to determine guilt, but to establish collective understanding through process. Without that process, speculation filled the vacuum. Despite repeated warnings from legal experts about the dangers of conflating suspicion with proof, government officials emphasized that investigations into systemic failures would continue, while simultaneously urging restraint and drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. Yet restraint is difficult when trust is already fragile, and the case had long been associated with perceptions of unequal justice. For many Americans, Epstein's death symbolized something larger than 1KCEE, reflected concerns about transparency, oversight, and whether systems designed to protect public interest function equally for all. The conversation expanded beyond Epstein himself, encompassing questions about prosecutorial correctional management, and the balance between security and accountability. It also reignited discussions about victim rights, because without a trial, many accusers felt deprived of a formal opportunity to be heard in the criminal process. Legal scholars noted that, while the justice system had mechanisms to continue civil accountability, criminal closure had become impossible. And so, the story shifted once again, from prosecution to legacy, from evidence to implication, from courtroom procedure to societal reflection. What does accountability look like when the central figure is no longer alive? How do institutions respond when procedural failure becomes part of the narrative? And can trust be rebuilt after such a public breakdown? These questions lingered not because answers were unavailable, but because the case had moved beyond legal resolution into the realm of collective doubt. At this time, we examine what followed: investigations, civil outcomes, and the broader lessons drawn from the case. Because when a story ends without a verdict, its impact is measured not by conclusions, but by the changes it forces into existence. After the silence, accountability, reform, and the legacy of an unfinished case when a criminal prosecution ends without a trial. The legal system closes one chapter, but public history begins another. And in the aftermath of Jeffrey Epstein's death, the focus shifted from individual guilt to institutional responsibility. With federal charges dismissed due to his death, attention turned toward what could still be pursued: civil litigation, systemic reform, and the ongoing rights of victims whose voices had yet to be fully heard in open court. Civil lawsuits continued against Epstein's estate, leading to financial settlements that acknowledged harm without requiring a criminal verdict. And these proceedings demonstrated that accountability in the American system does not rely on a single legal pathway. In 2020, federal authorities arrested Ghislaine Maxwell on charges related to sex trafficking and conspiracy. And in 2021, she was convicted in federal court, providing at least one courtroom resolution connected to the broader investigation. Maxwell's conviction reinforced that while one defendant was no longer alive, the judicial process could still examine evidence, testimony, and responsibility through other channels. At the same time, public attention remained fixed on the circumstances of Epstein's detention and death, prompting internal reviews within the Bureau of Prisons and renewed scrutiny of staffing shortages and oversight procedures. Reports issued by the Department of Justice Inspector General acknowledged significant failures at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, including missed security checks and falsified documentation, findings that confirmed procedural breakdown rather than conspiracy. These findings did not erase doubt. Still lingered, but explanations emerged, but they provided documented explanations rooted in operational failure, highlighting systemic weaknesses rather than hidden orchestration. In response, conversations about federal prison reform gained momentum, emphasizing the importance of staffing standards, transparency mechanisms, and independent review processes. Beyond institutional reform, universities and philanthropic organizations reassessed prior associations, with several launching investigations into past donations and implementing stricter vetting policies for major contributors. These reviews signaled a broader cultural shift, recognizing that reputational risk and ethical accountability must extend beyond legal minimums. Meanwhile, survivors continued to speak publicly about their experiences, reframing the narrative away from speculation and toward documented testimony that focused human impact rather than elite networks. This reframing mattered, because cases involving powerful individuals often become dominated by discussions of influence, overshadowing those most directly affected. Legal experts have pointed out that the Epstein case illustrates how prosecutorial discretion, plea bargaining, and federal-state jurisdictional boundaries can dramatically shape outcomes long before a trial ever begins. It also demonstrated how investigative journalism can reopen cases that once appeared settled, proving that scrutiny does not expire simply because time has passed. Perhaps most significantly, the case became a symbol of public distrust in institutions, revealing how quickly confidence erodes when transparency appears incomplete. Yet distrust alone does not define legacy. Reform efforts, policy reviews, and legal accountability measures also become part of the historical record. The question is not whether the story ended, it did, but whether its ending changed the systems that allowed it to unfold as it did. Did the 2008 plea agreement alter how prosecutors approach high-profile defendants? Did detention oversight procedures improve as a result of the documented failures in 2019? Did institutions adopt stricter ethical safeguards when accepting funding from controversial figures? These are measurable outcomes, not abstract suspicions, and they form the tangible aftermath of a case that once seemed beyond scrutiny. In the broader context of American justice, the Epstein case serves as a study in complexity rather than conspiracy, revealing how law, power, procedure, and perception intersect in ways that rarely produce simple conclusions. It reminds us that legal resolution and public satisfaction are not always aligned, and that accountability can take multiple forms: criminal conviction, civil liability, policy reform, and historical reassessment. For content creators, analysts, and historians, the lasting significance of this case lies not in speculation, but in documented lessons about oversight, transparency, and the resilience of investigative persistence. Because when institutions fail, the response to that failure defines whether trust can be restored. And when stories end without a verdict, the legacy is measured not by what was proven in court, but by what was strengthened afterward. The Jeffrey Epstein case remains one of the most scrutinized legal controversies of the 21st century, not because it answers every question, but because it forces institutions and audiences to confront the tension between power and accountability. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: justice is not a single event, but an evolving process shaped by law, evidence, oversight, and the willingness to examine uncomfortable truths within documented boundaries. And while the prosecution may have ended, the implications continue to ripple through legal systems, media standards, and public expectations, quietly shaping the future of accountability long after the headlines fade. The Jeffrey Epstein case did not end with a verdict. It ended with questions that reshaped public trust: a controversial plea agreement, a renewed federal prosecution, a detention failure that sparked national debate, and reforms that continue to ripple through institutions today. This case was never just about one individual. It exposed the tension between influence and accountability, between negotiation and justice, between procedure and public perception. In the absence of a final trial, the legacy became something different. A case study in how systems respond under pressure. And perhaps the most lasting impact is this: when transparency falters, scrutiny intensifies, and when oversight fails, reform becomes inevitable. Thank you for watching. If you value documented analysis over speculation and clarity over noise, subscribe and continue the conversation, because some stories may close in court, but their impact continues long after the headlines fade.